everyone, I'm Ava. I'm an American living here in the Netherlands, and today I wanted to share with you some aspects of American culture that I actually quite like. Now, usually in my videos, I tend to focus on the things that I really enjoy about my new chapter here in the Netherlands, and I guess that makes sense because I moved for a reason. It would be pretty weird if I moved and I hated it and I continued to live here. I love it here. But there are definitely some aspects of American culture that I've come to appreciate now that I actually live in Europe. So I thought I would share those things with you here today because why not? That could be interesting. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about today is how I actually think that some things in the US tend to be pretty informal, and I've realized that I think I like that. There's something to be said about having a long history of certain customs that are very cute, and I really like that here in the Netherlands, that there are all of these little customs that I get to participate in, and it really makes me feel like I'm immersing myself in a completely different society with its cultural norms. However, I think there's something interesting in the US that because it's a young country, I think, that there's a little less sense of, age-long tradition or customs. And so things are done a little differently. And in most cases, I find things to be very informal and less stuffy. So to illustrate my point, I'm going to give you an example about PhD defenses. It might seem pretty random if you don't know me, but I have a PhD in linguistics, so I can actually talk about this because I have experienced a PhD defense here in the Netherlands, and I've also experienced my own PhD defense in the US and very many others in the US. And I thought today I'm going to compare these and talk about these examples to you to show you what I mean. So a PhD defense generally tends to be a big deal because you work on your thesis for several years, and then it's like one day where you need to present it to this large audience, and no big deal, 4 or 5 years plus worth of work will be evaluated in a couple of hours, and there'll be a whole committee judging you, and you need to do a lot of public speaking. Like I said, no big deal. Kidding. Very, very big deal. So it's definitely a big deal both in the US and in the Netherlands. Now, in the Netherlands, it is very obvious that it is a big deal. How so, you ask? Well, the PhD defense I went to here was first of all in a beautiful church. A friend of my girlfriend's was defending her PhD, and I had the privilege to attend, which was very nice. And I got to go to this beautiful old church, and people were dressed up in fancy attire. So her committee, they all wore robes, think Harry Potter plus robes, and they were there dressed in that. There was this church, as I mentioned, and people were dressed kind of like for a wedding. I was extremely underdressed in jeans and a sweater. That was a mistake I made. So the person who was defended her dissertation. She had a presentation, which, okay, makes sense. That's the whole point. But she had a certain amount of time allotted for that presentation, and she had to stick within it. She also had a paranimf, I believe, which is someone who could step in case something happens to her or she's unable to continue with her presentation. So the presentation goes on for some time, and then at the end of it, the next step is that this committee that's dressed in Harry Potter robes will ask questions, and they ask it to this big hall, and we are sitting there in the pews waiting to, hear the verdict of whether she passed or not. And how do you know when time is up for these questions? Someone enters the room dressed in Harry Potter robes, and they have this big staff. They come in and they walk through the aisles, and then they stand there and then they stomp their little staff thing. Okay, big staff thing. They stomp it and they go, "Ora es, don't jump." And I remember sitting there what is going on? I was extremely shocked because I had not anticipated everything else, because I knew it was going to be in a church, but I had no idea that it was going to be so formal and that there were all these customs attached to it. So if you haven't been to a Dutch PhD defense, this is what it's like. It's quite fascinating. Now let us talk about PhD defenses in the US to illustrate my point. I'm going to talk about my own defense, where I dressed up in nicer pants and a blazer, and I presented. There was no fixed amount of time that I needed to talk for. I talked for about an hour, but I could have talked for less, I could have talked for more. That was kind of up to me. There were some loose rules around like don't go over an hour because people will get bored, but we can feel free to ignore that. Where did my PhD defense take place? Why? It took place in a sterile conference room that we used to have classes in our building. We didn't go anywhere special. It was just a room that I reserved to have people come and attend. My advisors were dressed in, working clothes, but like not in robes. So they weren't like in jeans and a t-shirt. I say that and I actually think that one of my advisors was in fact in his jeans and a t-shirt, but it didn't matter because the way they dress doesn't really have an effect on what they think of your presentation or anything. And then the people who attended were all just wearing everyday clothes. So it was a really informal affair. I presented and then afterwards I got asked questions by the room, and it's not just the committee members like my advisors who can ask questions, it's like anyone can ask questions. Like after the advisors are done asking their difficult questions and you're there sweating and answering things, then anyone in the audience can ask a question. If your mom's there and your mom has a question, your mom can ask that question. I could not imagine this happening in the Netherlands. So I think while this is an example of something quite specific, I think it shows what things are like in the US. It's less stuffy, pretty informal, relaxed, and I kind of like that. So the next thing that I really like about the way American society is built is that if you are born in the US, you are an American citizen automatically. Now in the Netherlands, you are not automatically a citizen of the Netherlands if you are born in this country. It's kind of more dependent on where your parents are from and what nationality your parents carry. While I see the reasoning behind that as someone whose family like kind of moves countries every generation, I definitely kind of gravitate more towards if you are born in this country and you grew up in this country's culture is what you're going to adapt. And of course it's something that I say based on my experience, but I find that it makes sense to me because if you're born somewhere and you live there, like even if your parents are from a different culture, you still have the culture of the country you were born and you live in. I don't think that citizenship should be limited to where you were born. To me, it's actually quite interesting that you could be born in the Netherlands and you won't necessarily be a Dutch citizen. And I guess that's true even if you live here for a few years as a child. Now, of course, you could become a Dutch citizen, but it just seems like it should be automatic. Maybe that's because it's what I'm used to. So the next two aspects of American culture that I want to talk about that I like are related to the point I mentioned about citizenship, about how if you're born in the US, you automatically get American citizenship. And the first of those 2 points is that I find that American cities, not all of the US, but my experience has been mostly living in American cities, that American cities tend to be this like melting pot of cultures. There's so many different cultures within a city, and I absolutely love that. I'm from New York City, and I am from Queens, the borough of Queens. If you are not familiar, look that up. I often get the question like, are you from Manhattan or Brooklyn? I am from Queens, and I am damn proud of it. Queens is really such a great illustration of what I'm trying to say, because every neighborhood just has its own special blend of cultures. The neighborhood I grew up in was a blend of lots of South Asian and Russian. And it was fantastic because I got to experience all of these foods and all of these languages around me. I went to a public high school in New York City, and I had classmates and just people at my school from all over the world. And going to that high school, I felt like I didn't even need to go visit these countries because I got to experience it while being in that high school. Just kidding. I of course want to go visit these countries. But all I'm trying to say is I got a lot of the cultural experience growing up in New York City. And I've had similar experiences living in Washington, DC and Philadelphia. So I really like that aspect of the melting pot. And a related point that I like about American culture is the fact that because you have this melting pot of different types of cultures, you get fantastic food. Now, I know that many people who live outside of the US, when they think of American food, they think of burgers and milkshakes and soda, and everything is like giant size. The part about everything being gigantic and extremely huge is true. However, it has always been a pet peeve of mine when people assume that there isn't good food in the US, because it could not be further from the truth, at least in big cities. Because You can get food from any culture you can imagine. Oftentimes the food is modified to suit Americans and to, be appropriated for American culture. But oftentimes you also get things that are quite authentic or just things that are different. So even if it is a fusion blend, it's different, and that is amazing to try. So actually living here in the Netherlands, while there is a variety of food to choose from, it's still less than what I was used to in the US. Another aspect of American culture that I actually quite like is the idea of the American dream. Don't get me wrong, the American dream is dead, but the idea of the American dream is something that I like. So my family is originally from Iran, but my parents, they were born in India and they grew up in India. So I am from an immigrant family in the US. My parents migrated to the United States. Now, because I come from this family background, I really like the idea of the American dream because my parents really had that. They felt like they could move to the US and they could become and achieve whatever they wanted. That's the idea of the American dream, that no matter where you're from, you can come and you can make it in the US. The dream is dead. That does not exist. But the idea behind it I like, because I find that many people migrate from all over the world and they look to start a new life in the US, and I find that to be so beautiful. And I've lived in so many different multicultural neighborhoods and cities, and I've known people from families similar to mine, and I think there is this shared bond and idea behind this American dream. So there's always this idea that immigrant parents want the best for their kids and they want their kids to succeed, or they have these dreams for themselves. And of course it's really hard and sometimes devastating when it doesn't work out the way people expected it to. But I do think this idea of the American dream still exists to a small degree, and you can see its influence in American culture. The next aspect of American culture that I wanted to share with you today is the idea that you should be yourself. You should be the best version of yourself, and you should feel free to stand out among the crowd. In the US, standing out is a good thing. Whereas here in the Netherlands, I've learned that doe normaal is everyone's slogan. So that just means, blend in with the crowd, don't do anything too excessive, just be part of the community, just don't do anything too crazy or out there, and you will be fine. That's the idea here, and there are lots of great aspects about that. But on the other side, I also like the idea that you can just be the best version of yourself, and you can just stand out and be the craziest you as long as you're not hurting anybody, go ahead. The idea that you are free to be who you are and stay true to yourself, and the idea that you're just allowed to be very loud. Maybe that's why Americans are so freaking loud. To me, this helps foster some kind of diversity in a way. Not diversity in the sense of coming from different backgrounds, but diversity in the sense that you get people with all kinds of personalities that are not afraid to show it. You kind of see that on the street. People may walk around with different hair colors, like blue, pink, or you may see people with different clothing styles. Lots of subcultures exist in the US, and of course that's true in the Netherlands as well, but I see that more in the US, and I think that that's just part of American culture. Just standing out is a good thing. And the final thing that I want to share with you today about what I like about American culture is that Americans tend to be very, very ambitious. I am someone who is ambitious as well, but to maybe a more moderate degree. And what I like about living here in the Netherlands is there's a strong idea of work-life balance. In America, we don't have work-life balance. What does that even mean? So while that isn't great, the ambition of Americans is something to be admired. I think people really want to work hard and rise through the ranks. And I admire that about people. Don't get me wrong, Dutch people are ambitious too. But in the US, people are ambitious at a whole other level. It's really impressive to see. I also think that Americans tend to have a can-do attitude. That's something that we really like to talk about. You should have a can-do attitude. So if there's something extra to be done for a project, you can count on Americans to take that on head on and complete it. When I moved to the Netherlands, I learned that you could just say no and say things like, no, I'm going on holiday. I'm not going to get to this. Whereas an American would be like, what holiday? I am here to succeed at my job and I'm going to get this done. So of course, while the extreme version of this ambition can have its negative side effects, I think it's something to be admired. So those were some aspects of American culture that I wanted to share with you today. As usual, do not hesitate to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Until next time.